Today I want to talk about something a little bit different, but important to the Second Amendment and to all of our rights. That is federal prosecutors. Those individuals responsible for bringing criminal cases in court on behalf of the United States Department of Justice. I want to give you some of my impressions from my professional experience in and around big-time law, because it may help you have some insights about what we're up against, as well as some of the events going on with the purge, if you will, of individuals that worked on the January 6 cases and some other cases in the Department of Justice who apparently, according to reports, are being fired. So let's talk about prosecutors, and let's get right into it right now. Hey folks, I'm Mark Smith, host of the Four Boxes Down, a proud American gun owner, constitutional attorney, member of the United States Supreme Court Bar, and I'm proud to say the top voice of the Second Amendment in the 2025 Gun News Awards. Thank you very much for your support. I appreciate it. It is a great honor to be considered and named the top voice of the Second Amendment in America today. All right, folks, so this is a little bit off the beaten path for this channel, but sometimes I want to bring you information that you're probably not going to get anywhere else. Based on my long experience as a New York City lawyer, national rank lawyer, whatever you want to call it, I want to talk to you about my experience with and my interactions with and my kind of impressions of federal prosecutors. Those people that are responsible for going into federal court on behalf of the United States government, who work for the Department of Justice, and basically try to put people in prison for violating federal criminal statutes. Now, this is important for all of our liberties, especially our Second Amendment rights, because virtually every federal gun control law has two things in common. The laws are dealing with victimless crimes that are Malum, Prohibitum. We've talked about this on this channel before. That these federal gun control laws simply require you to somehow run afoul of some artificial line drawn by legislators, by the Congress. Your barrel was too short. You have a bump stock. You have some weird contraption on your gun that they think is a suppressor. All of these are major crimes that you can go to prison for. But they all have a couple other things in common. Almost all of these, if not all of these, are victimless crimes, meaning that you get to go to prison for violating a federal gun control law even if you've never hurt a fly. Even if there's no victim. Nobody you've interacted with has lost money. No one you've interacted with has been hurt physically or violently or otherwise. Nevertheless, you get to go to prison as a felon. Relatedly, these gun laws have no moral component. Now, what do I mean by that? In basic criminal law, and then we're going to segue into prosecutors in just one second, but I want you to understand the basics of criminal law at the most basic level. Criminal laws generally break into two categories. We've talked about it before on this channel. Malum in se, which is the classic criminal laws that we're all familiar with, that have been basically criminal laws against human society for thousands of years. Malum in se is Latin for basically meaning evil in and of itself, immoral or evil in and of itself. We know what these crimes are. They're the most heinous crimes of human society. They're murder, rape, robbery, theft, beating people up, assaulting them, battery. These sort of immoral, evil crimes that have a component to it. Because these laws arise from this sort of evil intent, the old saying that says, ignorance of the law is no excuse, might have made sense when the laws were limited in number and tied into some moral component. So maybe you didn't know the exact law that you were violating, but you knew that stealing money from a little old lady, or from punching somebody in the head, or from shooting someone for fun, you kind of knew there was a problem in your inner human self because it was just naturally, innately evil, immoral. So even if you didn't know the specific elements of a law, you at least understood you were doing something wrong because there was some evil component to it, some moral component to it. As opposed to what we see with modern day federal gun control laws These are known as Malum Prohibitum crimes. Now, the difference between Malum in se, which is evil in and of itself, and Malum Prohibitum crimes is Malum Prohibitum crimes are just crimes that are crimes because a bunch of legislators said so. The length of a barrel of a rifle that's too short makes you a felon and too long is fine is a classic example of Malum Prohibitum. It's only a felony and you only get to go to prison because the barrel's too short on a shotgun or a rifle. There's no moral component. There's nothing evil about having a short barrel rifle or a short barrel shotgun. There's nothing evil about it. There's no victims, nothing. It's just a Malum Prohibitum crime. Now, the reason why this distinction between Malum in se and Malum Prohibitum is so key is because so much of the work done by federal prosecutors involves these Malum Prohibitum crimes. Victimless crimes with no evil component. And by the way, the notion that you or even I could possibly know every law in America, so that the argument that says ignorance of the law is no excuse is ridiculous. I can tell you that my law firm and I, over the years, we have retained every conceivable type of lawyer in America. We've done bankruptcy lawyers and criminal lawyers and employment lawyers and ERISA lawyers. I can't even, infinite types of lawyers and experts on every conceivable concept. Because even though I'm a very sophisticated lawyer, and I know a lot about the law and I know a lot of laws, the laws are so ubiquitous and crazy and infinite in number today in American life that even a good lawyer can't know everything. It's just impossible. There are too many laws out there. So the notion of ignorance of the law is no excuse today really, in my opinion, makes no sense, even though that's still technically the guidepost or the general rule of the road today, that ignorance of the law is not an excuse. But the reality is, I don't know how any ordinary person can possibly know all of these laws when a sophisticated lawyer cannot know the same. Okay, so with that said, let's talk about prosecutors, because this is in the news in a big way, and I want to talk about my impressions of them. And I'm not going to beat up prosecutors, but I am going to say some things that some people might not like. That's okay. I'm not here to do rainbows and unicorns. I'm here to tell you how I see it in my experience. You see, federal prosecutors, in my opinion, and I have a lot of interaction with them over the years, okay? I even was an intern back in law school with the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York, very prestigious district. So I'm quite familiar with prosecutors. I have a lot of friends that were prosecutors, that are retired prosecutors, and so on and so on. But the purpose I want to talk about on this video, or the reason why I'm talking about this video, is why I think that prosecutors have an unfair advantage. And it's not their personal fault, by the way. It's the system's fault. But I believe that federal prosecutors have an unfair advantage over most criminal defendants. And that, frankly, federal prosecutors, even though it's a prestigious position in the eyes of many, I view it as sort of overrated from my perspective of what I do. And this is not to denigrate prosecutors, it's just to tell you my perspective in the world of big law. And the reason why I say they're overrated is because their job, in my opinion, is relatively easy. And why is that? Well, just think about it. The odds are tremendously stacked in favor of federal prosecutors. Aside from the fact that every time you go into court, you get to say, I represent the United States of America. A patriot I am. I am representing the good guys, the government. So that alone makes jurors and people say, oh, wow, he's representing the U.S. government. He's like the good guy, right? You get the idea. So that alone starts that off in their favor. Then the reality of this is this. The federal prosecutors have infinite resources. In addition to all the lawyers in their offices, in their respective U.S. attorneys' offices, they have all the resources of Maine Department of Justice in Washington. They have all the resources of the entire federal government. They can pick up the phone and get anyone they want in the federal government on the phone, basically. If they need somebody from the Census Bureau, if they need somebody from the EPA, if they need somebody from the FDA, and of course, if they need anyone associated with the Department of Justice, if they need some federal contractor, whatever it is that they need, guess what? They're going to be able to get them on the phone. Now let's flip and look at the other side. We know that a large percentage of Americans today, unfortunately, are not able to withstand even a $1,000 surprise bill. Meaning if you hit an American out of the blue with a $1,000 bill that they're not expecting because of a medical bill, a legal bill, whatever it is. We know a large percentage of Americans simply can't afford to pay that kind of bill overnight. They're not in a financial position. That's the reality of it. And the reason why this is significant is if someone gets into trouble personally, or a family member, or a friend, or a colleague, somebody you want to support, and they're indicted, or they get in some investigation where they could be charged with a crime, whether they are or not, it's a separate issue. Most Americans, not all, but a lot of Americans are not going to be in a position to hire lawyers that are able to compete, in my opinion, with the vast resources of the U.S. Attorney's offices, of the Department of Justice, which is massive. So they get to either rely upon a federal public defender, which I totally support federal public defenders. I think they do a great job. Federal public defenders are great. But the reality is, like all public defenders, in most instances, they're super overworked. They have a lot of cases. They don't have the same resources as the other side to work up cases, to get experts. They have resources, of course, and they do a lot of work, but they have a lot of cases. And here's the critical difference. If you're a federal prosecutor and you don't want to prosecute Mark because it's too hard, you can't get the experts, the witnesses don't line up, you're bored, you don't like it, whatever it is, you don't want to prosecute Mark, you just don't do it. You're like, forget it, I'm going to let that case go. I'll do something else. You have the ability as a federal prosecutor, you have the discretion in most cases to just drop investigations, to not pursue a case, to not be bothered with it. If you're a federal public defender on the other side representing an indigent defendant, you don't have the luxury to drop cases. You have to handle any case that comes in where the person is entitled to a lawyer. So again, they're often overworked. And again, let's go back to a situation where somebody has enough money that they don't qualify to get a federal public defender because they're not an indigent. They have resources, but they're not super wealthy or they're not rich. Well, they got to go into their pocket and dig into their savings and take out a mortgage or home equity loan or something to hire some competent lawyer to fight back. And even if they pay a whole bunch of money to a private attorney who may be excellent, that private attorney, no matter how good they are, simply doesn't have the same level of resources to fight back against the multi-trillion-dollar budget federal government. It remains not a fair fight, in my opinion. So when I see prosecutors that work for the U.S. Attorney's Office, which in many instances is viewed as a prestigious position, you get to go on TV, you get to go on Fox News and the big networks and be a former federal prosecutor. Yeah, and that's all true. There's an element of prestige to this, in my view. There is some element of prestige, but probably a lot of it's undeserved. Because, again, it's a perfectly fine job, but, all the odds are stacked in your favor. So, in many respects, in my opinion, you're a little bit more like a bully than engaged in a fair fight. It's not like big law where you have like a massive law firm against another massive law firm and you're fighting against big hedge funds and big private equity firms and super wealthy people and banks and insurance companies, and everyone is fighting to the death with, a dozen lawyers on either side, and you have a fair fight, right? You have equally matched lawyers and equally matched resources going to battle with each other. But that's not usually the dynamic, in my experience, in federal court when you're dealing with a federal prosecutor prosecuting individuals. It's not a fair fight as a general matter because the defendants, as a general matter, sometimes you get somebody like a Martha Stewart type defendant. It does happen. But mostly day to day, you're up against defendants that are either indigents or just don't have the resources to fight back against the multi-trillion-dollar federal government and the multi-billion-dollar Department of Justice budget. Now, beyond this, the reason why I want to talk about this in this context of prosecutors is not because I just want to beat up prosecutors, of whom many former prosecutors are friends of mine, and there's some YouTubers out there that are former prosecutors, so I'm not here to beat them up. I'm just here to give you some realities of modern life. Now, the reason why this is particularly important is because you probably have seen these news stories of these prosecutors that apparently have been fired by the Department of Justice that worked on or in and around some of this January 6th defendant stuff. And as part of this, people are like, how are they all getting fired? And why are they being asked? Apparently, the reporting also says, and this is kind of interesting, that these lawyers who are being fired are also being asked to withhold and maintain and not destroy documents. Don't destroy emails. These are called litigation hold documents. Now, people may ask, why are these former prosecutors being fired? These prosecutors being fired, now they're former prosecutors, and why are they being asked to maintain all their emails, their text messages, documents associated with all their work involving the Donald Trump case, the January 6 cases, and so on? And I think there's several reasons why a litigation hold letter may have gone out to these former prosecutors. You see, former prosecutors may have legal liability, or maybe they don't. We don't know. There's no way to know in this particular situation. But what might be going on here is that the government, the Trump administration, as well as Congress, may be looking to engage in investigations of some of these prosecutors or the entire Department of Justice under Joe Biden. We don't know. And the reason that they might be interested in some of this is there may be criminal liability. They may want to see if, for example, some of these prosecutors withheld evidence. We know, for example, there's a lot of talk about over 40,000 hours of videotape evidence that was never turned over to the January 6 defendants and or the public. So maybe somebody thinks there's a possible criminal case to be made against these prosecutors. Maybe yes, maybe no. I don't know. I'm not in a position to opine either way, but that may be one of the reasons why the litigation hold letter went out. Possibly there's some concerns about civil lawsuits where the January 6 defendants intend to bring lawsuits against some or all of these prosecutors, or perhaps against the agency where they become witnesses. Maybe they just want to hold the documents because these prosecutors could become witnesses, and maybe there's no concern about civil or criminal liability either way. Or, of course, maybe there's a concern that some of these prosecutors are going to sue to get their jobs back or to claim damages from lost income. One doesn't know that. And, of course, obviously, maybe some of them will be subpoenaed by Congress, so they'll have to give testimony and documents to Congress about how all this January 6th stuff went down. Because, as you know, in at least one major case, the U.S. Supreme Court in the Fisher case basically threw out the major criminal charge that was being used against a lot of the January 6 defendants, because it came with the charge a possible 20-year, that's right, a possible 20 years in prison penalty or sentence if you were convicted under that law. But of course, the U.S. Supreme Court said that law did not apply to the defendants engaged in the activities of January 6th. And I should also mention that there is ample history in American life for prosecutors to get in trouble with the law because of their misbehavior in cases. And again, I'm not suggesting that any of these prosecutors involved with January 6th or these prosecutors that are fired from Department of Justice, I'm not saying any of them have done anything wrong at all. I'm just saying that what may be investigated, or what some people in the current DOJ may be asking themselves or looking into, is do we have a situation where they withheld evidence or did something improper with what's so-called Brady evidence, which is potentially exculpatory evidence that a criminal defendant could use to defend against a prosecutor's charge of committing a crime. So there's a couple famous examples of this. You may remember the Senator Ted Stevens from Alaska, who was found guilty originally in a trial in the District of Columbia, but it turns out that the lawyers that prosecuted Ted Stevens withheld evidence back, and there was a very big scandal here because according to the reports that were done, the prosecutors apparently hid evidence that would have exonerated Ted Stevens, Senator Ted Stevens, the Republican from Alaska. And by the way, because he was convicted, he lost his Senate seat and was not able to vote against Obamacare, as I recall, because he lost that Senate seat in a trial that turned out to be hooey because, again, not all the evidence was made available to him that the government had. And that was a big scandal many years ago. Likewise, you may remember the so-called Duke lacrosse rape case, where the alleged victim has just come out and basically recanted everything, I believe, like in the last month or two, but set that issue aside. Even before that, the prosecutor of the Duke lacrosse players in that case where the alleged stripper allegedly was raped by the Duke lacrosse players, none of that was true. Big lawsuits against Duke University over all this stuff by the lacrosse players and so on. But the bottom line was this: Mike Nifong, the district attorney that brought the criminal cases or basically blew up the lacrosse team and the Duke lacrosse players' reputations and so on, Mike Nifong was ultimately disbarred for shenanigans associated with those criminal cases. So my only point of talking about the Ted Stevens criminal case and the Mike Nifong criminal case is to show you that prosecutors can get into trouble if they misbehave in criminal cases. So with all that said, we're going to keep you abreast of what's going on with some of this January 6th, some of this Department of Justice stuff, not because I want to belabor the point on this channel, but because I think it's helpful for you to get a sense of what's going on with some of these key players in the American legal system, especially federal prosecutors who are responsible for indicting you and for indicting me if we ever violate a federal gun control law. So it's always good to know who technically is on the other side in the event we are allegedly to have committed a federal gun crime in some way. And hopefully you never do that, and hopefully I never do this, but at least I want you to understand my perspective on federal prosecutors that work for the United States Department of Justice. So there you have it. Hope you learned something here today about inside baseball and the legal system. Make sure you follow me on X at @4boxes Diner. Don't forget to follow me and subscribe to both Rumble and YouTube. And I look forward to talking to all again really, really soon here at the 4 Boxes Diner.
Orders up. Table 2A.